Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name is DeGette, and I'm the chair of the Colorado Young Democrats. I wanted to welcome you to this very unique debate we have today between our two wonderful Democratic candidates for the 1st Congressional District. Before we hear a little bit from them, just wanted to take a minute to recognize some of the party leadership we have with us today. If you are a candidate for office or an elected official, would you please stand and be recognized? I think we have someone coming out. And if you're an officer of the state or county parties or the state or county Young Democrats, please stand and be recognized. Thank you all. Both candidates have agreed to a format. They'll have 3 minutes for their opening statements. We'll then move on to a domestic policy section in which they'll have 2 minutes to answer questions with an optional 30-second response for the first candidate who answers, and they'll be alternating who answers first. Moving on to foreign policy, then we'll take a brief break and have a few more sections after that. By chance of decision of who would be speaking first, it will be Mr. Norris. Mr. Norris, please. Please welcome both of our candidates.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank all of you for turning out on a wonderful Saturday afternoon where it would be much more pleasant to be doing something else, I'm sure. I'd like to thank the Colorado Young Democrats for hosting this debate. My name is Charles Norris. I do go by Chuck, so we can get the laugh out of the way. I'm a geologist. I've been a geologist my whole career, and the career is still ongoing. I started this campaign back in November of 2014, shortly after the last election. And that campaign has been based upon tripod of 3 legs: cash, carbon, and community. Cash is a reference to the money that's in politics and that is buying our government these days on all levels. Carbon is a short statement for the climate change that we're doing with the gases that we're putting in the atmosphere. And community is that collection of issues that we have that in the last 5 and 10 years have steadily been fraying the fabric of our society. Those are the 3 principles on which I've been running. We are in a world now that, although we aren't fully aware of it yet, has changed. The rules that control how we live in that world are no longer, or at least the rules of thumb, are no longer valid. The impact of this change is something that we're going to see down the road. But the change has already occurred. In discussing climate change in the past, I've used the phrase that the bus has already driven off the cliff. That is absolutely the case. We just have to decide how we're going to manage the landing of that bus in order to salvage what we can. The world that has changed that I'm talking about now, however, is not climate change. It's our political world. It's what the United States is going to accept in the domain of politics. What we have done in the past is not going to work in the present, and the change is here.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the Colorado Young Democrats for sponsoring this debate, and thanks to this wonderful audience As Chuck said, bringing everybody out on a wonderful spring afternoon isn't always easy, and it shows how interested you are in our politics. I'm so proud to represent this congressional district in the U.S. Congress, and today I'd like to ask for all of your support both in the primary and general election. In Congress, I've been standing up for you, and I've been working to get things done. Over the past year or so, I've passed comprehensive legislation to restructure the way we do biomedical research in this country to help bring cures much more quickly from the research lab into the clinic. This will benefit millions of Americans, people who suffer from diseases for which we have no cure: Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, diabetes, cancer. I'm so proud. We passed this legislation through the House last July, 344 to 77, and it's on track to pass the Senate and be to the President's desk before the August recess. Why is this so important to me? It's because of my young friend Max. I've met Max since I've been working on this bill, 21st Century Cures. Max is 7 years old, and he has an incurable rare disease. Every time we make a new milestone in our bill, passing it through one committee or one house or another, Max makes me a beautiful picture, full of hope. And last week, Max's mom brought me another picture Max made just for me, and that's why I do this. Also, just in the last year, despite the gridlock in Congress, I've passed 2 renewable energy initiatives. One of them creating hundreds of jobs here in Colorado and thousands of jobs around the country, supporting small hydropower projects around the country. Another of them helping to put forward and to advance LED technology and renewable technology so that we can save energy in places like this and in places all across our country. And as co-chair of the Congressional Pro-Choice Caucus, I led the fight to stand up against the defunding of Planned Parenthood. And you know something? I won. There's so much more to do. We must pass comprehensive climate change legislation. We must reform our election process, not just by repealing Citizens United, but by having full disclosure and congressional funding, and federal funding for congressional elections. And we must improve college affordability. I look forward to talking to you about these issues and many, many other issues in the hour and a half to come. Thank you very much.
We'll start with our domestic policy section. Again, both of you will have 2 minutes to respond, and the first candidate to respond will have an optional 30-second rebuttal. For the first 3 questions, the first questions will be asked by the presidents of our county Young Dems chapters.
Good morning, I'm Rebecca Sunshine. I'm the president of the Denver Young Democrats. Our first question goes to Representative DeGette to begin with. A woman's right to access abortion services is a central component of the Democratic platform, and both of you have stated that you are pro-choice. However, across the country, in state legislatures, as well as in Washington, D.C., we have seen conservatives continue to pass legislation chipping away at women's rights. In your capacity, how would you lead rather than simply follow the rest of your caucus in protecting these rights?
Rebecca, as you just heard me say, I'm the co-chair of the Congressional Pro-Choice Caucus. This is a caucus of about 160 members of Congress fighting for a woman's right to full reproductive health every day. And not only were we fighting to keep the funding for Planned Parenthood, but in almost every bill, it seems that there's an effort to restrict a woman's right to health care. I'm leading that fight in Congress. Let me just say one more thing, which is if anybody didn't think this election was one of the most important of our lifetime, think about the Supreme Court. Think about the Supreme Court ruling last week on birth control. Who knew that we would be debating birth control in 2016? And whoever wins as president, along with the leadership in the House and along with the leadership of the pro-choice caucus, in the House and in the Senate is going to be picking a justice who not only will preserve Roe versus Wade and a woman's right to choose, but who will also be preserving the very fundamental right of women to get access to birth control and family planning.
As I have stated repeatedly in the meetings I've had with people around the district and have clearly put on the webpage, I stand full with women and their right for reproductive choices. It is a woman's choice. It is no one else's choices. As far as providing a leadership toward that, I think we have to do better than the Women's Caucus has done in the last 10 years. We have lost ground in the last 10 years. The attacks that are coming across the country are coming in spite of the efforts that the Democrats have put into it in the past. And we need to look more at why we're losing ground rather than patting ourselves on the back for what we've done in the past. One of the critical aspects that goes back to a bill that was signed in 1993 is the Freedom of Religion Restoration Act or something of that nature. Now that didn't have a lot of teeth into it, and not much was done until the Supreme Court decided in Citizens United that corporations are people and that they have rights under the Constitution. They are now, as corporations, using their religious beliefs as corporations to foster legislation that allows an assault on both the LGBT community, on women's reproductive rights, and a host of other social things that we unfortunately as Democrats thought we had won and had backed off from defending.
Well, let me just respond briefly. It's not just the Women's Caucus that's been pushing these bills. In fact, it's the Pro-Choice Caucus. And we have many men who support a range of reproductive rights for women. And the reason is because they know reproductive rights are family rights, and they affect every American. I do agree that we need to push the ball forward. And that's why I've been one of the prime co-sponsors of the All Above All Act, which is a bill that would repeal, which would repeal the Hyde Amendment that restricts poor women's rights against women.
Hi, my name is Saeed Sharvini. I'm president of the Rapidly Young Democrats. Young people today are carrying more debt than ever before. Do you support free college education, debt reduction or forgiveness programs, or another option to help make college more affordable? And also, is there a distinction between vocational schools and four-year college and universities in your plans?
First, I would have to take a little bit of objection to part of your question in that there is no such thing as free education. There never will be free education. Education costs. It's a question of, as a society, how do we want to handle that cost? Who best should that cost be carried by in order for us as a society to succeed? What we have now is a method of paying for education that puts the burden on the student coming out of school, burdened with literally more proportionally than the house I first bought when I first went to work. That is not going to work. That is going to keep those people from being a significant contributing part of our economic society for years or decades down the road. I think the involvement at the federal level of helping pay for education through taxes with a combination of forgiveness for services and a recognition that four-year colleges are not necessarily for everyone nor needed for every occupation, and that the education improvements and revisions should also go to those seeking the two-year degrees and even the trade degrees.
Colorado, we're blessed because we're the #1 destination for millennials right now in the United States. I keep trying to use that to get my 2 millennials to move back home, so far without a lot of success. But as they're coming here, what we're finding, as well as our beautiful quality of life, we also have higher and higher cost of living, housing costs, but not just housing costs, transportation, food, and everything else. One thing that I've said is, you can't buy a house in Colorado, in the 1st Congressional District right now, if your loan burden is already the size of a mortgage. You just simply can't do that. That's why I'm really focusing on 3 pieces of federal legislation that I think will help young people deal with the crushing burden that they have right now. #1, we need to give people the ability to consolidate their student loans and lower their interest rates. #2, we need to increase the size of Pell Grants so that when people graduate from college, they have a lower loan burden and they've been able to get more of that paid for through Pell Grants. And finally, we should have a program federally for loan forgiveness for people who go into public service. I just met a young woman the other day who wants to go into public service, but she can't afford to do it because her loan burden is in the 6 figures. Not only is that a burden on her, it's a burden on all of us because we really need her out in the community helping people to advance their lives. So that's the program that I'm going to focus on, and I think that when we get new leadership in the White House and in the Senate and in the House, we'll be able to pass that. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm Eliza Fernie. I'm the president of the Jefferson County Young Democrats. And my question is, the American middle class is rapidly shrinking. What specifically can Congress do to make sure we are paid a living wage and there are high-paying jobs that people of all ages can work their way into?
Eliza, thank you for that important question. I'm sure you've seen the statistics that show that the gap between the very wealthiest in this country, not just the 1%, but the 0.01%, is higher than it ever has been between the middle class. I think we need to really focus on reducing that gap by changing tax policy and by giving more tax credits and more tax relief to middle class folks and less to corporations and people who take their business offshore. But in addition, on a federal level, we must increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour right now. Here's a really radical idea for 2016. We need to have equal pay for equal work. Finally, we need to have family and medical leave at the federal level so everybody can take time with a child or with a sick relative. Those are just 3 things we can do right away. There's a lot more that we need to do to strengthen the middle class, and I'm committed to doing that.
The list of things that can and should be done to help the middle class were very well laid out by Congressman DeGette. The minimum wage should be immediately taken to $15. The family leave policies should be put in place. We need to find at the federal level ways to get newly graduated students out from under their debts so they can contribute to the society. We also need to reform our prisons and the way we treat the people coming out of prisons so that they are not condemned to a life where they do not have access to housing, they do not have access to jobs, to training, they do not have access to careers that require, that preclude those with a criminal background. When we start subtracting large portions of our population, and we have more people in prison than any other country in the world, whether absolute or relative, that is a huge group of people that we are condemning to poverty, many of whom could become viable members of the community and help grow the middle class. We have to think outside the simple bromides of equal pay for equal work. We have used that so long and never put it in place. We need to include in equal pay for equal work the handicapped, not just those that are gender discriminated against. So all of those would be areas that I would concentrate
In, you said no rebuttal, thank you.
No.
Oh, thank you, just want to check. In 2012, Colorado residents overwhelmingly supported Amendment 65, known as the Colorado Corporate Contributions Amendment, at 74 to 26%. This supported tweaks in state policy limiting corporate contributions and expenditures, and was seen by many as a protest against the Citizens United decision. Do you support Citizens United? And if not, what actions, including legislation, a constitutional convention, or other ideas, would you support to overturn Citizens United? Mr. Norris.
No, I do not support Citizens United. I think it is one of the most grotesque decisions that has come down from the Supreme Court, probably in the history of the country. Not only because it unleashed the huge amounts of money from the corporate world that have so enthralled both political parties, but because it assigned First Amendment rights to corporations. And if you read the preamble to the Constitution as "we the corporations of the United States," you understand how bad it is. Citizens United absolutely needs to be done away with. I think the easiest way to do it is with a constitutional amendment. I would be totally adverse to a constitutional convention. A constitutional amendment does not open up other parts of the Constitution to change. It merely clarifies the language that is in the Constitution to help the poor members of the Supreme Court pass their mistakes. We also have to get the corporate money and the PAC money and the lobbyists out of campaign funding. We don't need workarounds to make it more palatable to us. We don't need additional money put in the sense of federal dollars. We need to stop letting corporations and interests continue to pay.
Well, here's a place that Mr. Norris and I completely agree. We are both 100% opposed to Citizens United. I agree. I think it has to be one of the worst pieces of jurisprudence ever to come out of our Supreme Court. And I think that we need to do whatever we can to reverse it. Let me tell you though, I'm not sure that a constitutional amendment is the easiest way to do that, although I'm not opposed to a constitutional amendment. But the reason is, think about the Equal Rights Amendment. Think about how long we've been trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, because it has to be approved by the House, by the Senate, and then by majority of the states. And so it would take years, if not decades, to try to do this by constitutional amendment. I think there's an easier way. And the easier way, I think, is by electing a Democrat president in November. Why do I think that? Because with the death of Justice Scalia, it's leaving a 4-4 split. And Citizens United was a 5-4 decision. If we get a justice on the Supreme Court who will reverse this injustice, then we will have begun to solve this problem. But it's just a beginning, and I'll tell you why. Because we would still have these super PACs, these shadowy 527s. Nobody knows who's paying for these ads. That's why we need to pass the Disclose Act in Congress, which would require the names of all these the donors to these shadowy efforts to be disclosed. And finally, I think we need to have public funding for congressional elections so that finally the people are having their say and that they can decide who they're going to elect. I'm supporting a bill along with Ed Perlmutter and Jared Polis for public funding of congressional elections.
Very simply, very clearly, we need less money in politics, not more money. We don't need to know the names of the bullies on the playground. We need the bullies taken off the playground. It's possible for any candidate to run without accepting political or corporate money. I made that decision. Any other candidate can too.
For our last question in the domestic policy section, we turn our attention to Puerto Rico. The U.S. territory of Puerto Rico is currently facing the possibility of economic collapse. What can and should be done to stabilize the Puerto Rican economy? Congresswoman?
Well, Puerto Rico is having a lot of problems right now. It's not just the fact that they're on the verge of bankruptcy, it's that the Zika virus is beginning to spread throughout Puerto Rico in a very disturbing way. The first thing about Puerto Rico, there has been legislation in both the House and the Senate to help give Puerto Rico the kind of support they need to do to put their financial house in order, and that legislation has been blocked by Paul Ryan and the Republican leadership in the House of Representatives. It's now getting to a crisis point. Puerto Rico is part of the United States, and it is important that we help them keep their economy strong so that they can continue to support the jobs and the welfare of all of the people who live there. But let me tell you about this Zika virus because it's only going to make things worse. Zika is now spreading throughout Central and South America. It's also rampant in Puerto Rico, and it's very, very dangerous. It impacts pregnant women. It can be transmitted sexually, and the mosquitoes that carry it are everywhere and pervasive. I am disgusted by the fact that the Republican majority has given the Obama administration only a tiny fraction of the money they need for emergency funding to stop Zika from spreading throughout the southern United States and the territories. It has been a real fight, and one might think if there was anything we could come together on, House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, it would be this emergency of Zika that is impacting so many of our U.S. citizens. So I think this is something we need to fight to get them those resources we need. Thank you.
The Puerto Rican financial problem is easily dismissed because it's just Puerto Rico. And we can have legislation where we come up with some kind of way to bail out Puerto Rico. They still get looked at, although they're part of the United States, as not really being part of the United States. And it's small wonder that they got themselves into trouble. That kind of condescension is unacceptable, but it's also unrealistic because the state of Illinois is in virtually the same problem for exactly the same reasons and is literally, if it were not a state, if it were a territory, would be defaulting on its paper as well. The problem has to do with the banking system that we allow to continue in this country in spite of the fact that it almost sent us into a recession 10 years ago, 8 years ago. Very few changes have been made in the control of banking. And if banking reform isn't universally done in and out of the United States, we're going to continue to have Puerto Ricos and Illinois, and we're going to continue to have a shrinking middle class. Thank you.
Just to add one thing, Mr. Norris mentioned the fact that Puerto Rico is frequently treated differently because it's a territory and not a state, and he's correct about that. And this is why we've had a bill for some number of years sponsored by a number of Puerto Rican members of Congress and others, and I'm a proud co-sponsor to give statehood to Puerto Rico. I think that that would be so important.
Thank you. That completes our domestic policy section. Moving on to foreign policy, you'll still have 2-minute responses with an optional 30-second rebuttal. Mr. Norris, many other nations, including some the U.S. consider allies, do not offer basic rights to women, members of the LGBTQ community, minority groups, and others. Do you feel the U.S. has an obligation to advocate for human rights in other countries, or do other factors like trade sometimes outweigh those concerns?
Absolutely, the U.S. should advocate for human rights at all levels. It should be part of our foreign policy. There isn't a price that you put on human rights such that you say, well, if this trade agreement is worth enough, we won't comment anymore. If we need Turkey's support sufficiently, then we will let them not acknowledge the Armenian deaths and the genocide. It's not an either or, and it's not really a balance. You pursue what you can in the way of trade agreements or international trade, at the same time making it clear that if the human rights that you're doing, or that you're abusing, are being abused, that will affect our relationship with you. It's unacceptable to us, and we will try and get you to change it.
The Bulwark American principles of human rights, equal rights for women, LGBTQ rights, all of those rights, they're really fundamental to the U.S. existence. And they need to be reflected throughout not just our domestic policy, but our policies around the world. And that's why I think it's so important that we work through the State Department, we work through all of our international alliances, NATO and other alliances, to foster these around the world, while at the same time making sure that we preserve them here in the United States. There are a number of levers that we can use in trade agreements, in defense agreements, to make these things happen. And I've said for a long time, my view on trade issues is that before we adopt any kind of a trade agreement, TPP or the TTIP agreement, any of the other agreements we've had since I've been in Congress, we need to make sure that the countries who we're entering into those trade agreements have a minimum standard for U.S. workers, for working men and women, for workers in those countries, and also that we protect worker standards in this country. And we also need to make sure that there's a basic level of human rights. Countries need to realize if they're going to violate those rights, then they are going to face sanctions from us and from our allies while we promote these around the world. Thank you.
Great. Congresswoman, the Obama administration has led global efforts to limit carbon emissions in order to slow climate change. One of the major hurdles has been persuading developing nations like China and India to commit to the standards endorsed by the developed nations in the West. What is the appropriate role of the United States in slowing the advance of climate change? Should we adopt standards developing nations are unwilling to commit to, or should we push for high standards but ultimately only bind ourselves to carbon emission standards supported by developing nations like China and India?
Well, the first thing is, we need to, in the United States, we need to recognize as a country that climate change exists and is an existential threat to us and to everybody else in this world. The only place where people still are denying climate change, unfortunately, is in the Republican caucus of the U.S. Congress of the United States. And that has to change. As a senior member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, I was the person in 2009 who was tasked with passing the Waxman-Markey bill, which was the climate change cap and trade legislation. We passed that bill through the U.S. House of Representatives, I believe it was 216 to 209 votes. And so I'm recommitting myself to putting together a coalition to pass that. I think that it is the #1 urgency that we have. And then beyond that, we have a lot of opportunities around the world. I was heartened with the Paris Agreement just this last year that it wasn't just the developed countries who agreed to standards, it was the developing countries, it was India, it was China. And I think, and also the island countries who are seeing this climate change directly on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's our responsibility to act as the leader for the world and to pass our own climate change legislation, and then to act as the partner for everybody else in the world to make this all happen. Thank you.
I think it is inappropriate to try and take the high ground as America being the leader in the attempt to control climate change. One of the developing countries that you mentioned, China, has reduced both in terms of tonnage and in terms of percentage of its carbon dioxide development more than the United States has, and has a much more aggressive plan to continue doing that. As a race, as a country, as individuals, we have to understand we cannot get our energy by burning carbon that comes from the earth anymore. It cannot be done. It is over. We need to, that is where the bus has driven off in climate terms. We move to take away the subsidies for the carbon extraction industries, and the alternative energies are already economically competitive. We can take the monies that we save from those subsidies, and we can retrain, retool the workforce and put them to work in the expanding alternative energy systems. And we can use trade agreements. must insist that trade agreements like the TPP have the carbon entry tax, the carbon tariff, if you will, that can be the club to make the other countries that aren't actively trying to do it conform. We have evacuated an island on our own Gulf Coast because of rising sea levels there.
I'm glad Mr. Norris brought up this idea of the tax credits for fossil fuel extraction. I don't see any reason why we need to have those tax credits, and I've been standing up for the elimination of those tax credits for many years now. On the other side, we do need to have tax credits and also loan forgiveness programs like the cylinder programs to make sure that we can make renewable energy competitive. And I'm very pleased to say that we got that done at the end of the year when we extended the renewable energy tax credits in the omnibus bill.
Mr. Norris. President Obama discussed Israel and Palestine, including the option of a two-state solution, as a top priority when elected. 8 years later, many feel we have not made much progress in the region. What concrete solutions do you feel we can take? What do you think President Obama, or a future president, hopefully not Donald Trump, can do?
Ultimately, there will not be a solution if it is not a two-state, two-nation solution. I will be very forthcoming that I do not have a plan to make that work. I think there are incredibly complex issues that are keeping that festering wound there. It serves purposes for people of a variety of backgrounds. I don't know how we get to that. It's just too far afield from my level of experience at this point.
I've been thinking about the issue of Palestine and Israel for some years now, and I am strongly committed to a two-state solution. There are many people who say because of the settlements in the territories that that's not a reasonable goal anymore, and I think they're wrong. Last November, I actually went to Israel and I went to the Palestinian territories. I met with everybody, from the settlers in the Jewish settlements to the leaders of Hamas. I went to Ramallah. I went everybody at every place, and I looked at it. And my opponent is right. It's not an easy solution, but it's an imperative solution. What you have going on in these areas right now is you have violent clashes every day at checkpoints. You have schoolgirls being stabbed. You have, and it's not just Israeli schoolgirls, it's Palestinian kids too. You have an untenable situation here. Believe you me, if we could have solved this, if it was an easy solution, we would have done it by now. But what I would say is this, is the next president of the United States, who will not be Donald Trump, I think we can agree on that on this stage here today. The next president, yes, clap for that. The next president of the United States will have to work with our partners around the world to help the Palestinians and Israelis get to yes. And I do believe it's going to be hard, but there are some people who have a vision. An extraordinary man that I met, Jeremy Ben-Ami, who is the son of some of the original Israeli freedom fighters, has a vision. Many others have a vision. We just need to make it happen. And I think we can't give up, because I don't think no is an answer.
Congresswoman, How do you feel the Obama administration has handled combating ISIS? What do you feel we can do differently, and what can Congress within their power do to better combat ISIS and other threats in the region?
ISIS is a existential threat to many areas of the Middle East, but it's also the militarism and the terrorism of ISIS is a threat to the democratic values that we were just talking about around the world. The way they treat women, the way they treat Christians and others who they disagree with is just not acceptable in the 21st century. And so I think that it's been a very intractable problem. One of the reasons why it's been such a difficult problem is because President George W. Bush sent us into Iraq, which is a place we never should have been to begin with, and therefore the United States' ability and appetite for entering into a coalition with our partners around the world was diminished. But I think that working with our coalition partners and working with our allies on the ground in the Middle East, we are beginning to turn back ISIS, and I think that's good. I do not believe in U.S. boots on the ground because I think it would be counterproductive and it would not help in the situation. But I do believe that air support and training have been essential to working with our allies to push back ISIS, and then I think we need to finish doing that. But again, it's an international effort. It's not just the U.S. And the reason it's an international effort is because ISIS and extremist terrorist organizations like that are a threat all around the world. Look at what just happened in Paris, for example, and so many other places in Europe. So that's why I think we need to work with our international partners to continue to fight against ISIS and other extremist organizations.
I think that what we're doing right now to combat ISIS is reasonable. I do not advocate putting boots on the ground. I do not advocate saturation bombing. I do not advocate killing their families, as one famous presidential wannabe has suggested. Strangle them with finance, cut off their supplies of money has been working extremely well. They are less able to attack than they have been in the past, and I think they can with persistence be caused to wither on the vine. And what we do need and must realize is that they are not something unique. They grew out of the extended famine in the Middle East, the change in climate does. Sub-Saharan Africa and Boko Haram are the same types of thugs that have taken over there as society has disintegrated because millennial-long areas that people could live have disappeared and are being forced to move. In Central America, the droughts in Middle America there have made the disruption in the society such that gangs from U.S. prisons have gone down and almost fully taken over those countries. This is 1% of the human population right now that is in migration as a result of climate change, and just the beginnings of climate change. In 30 to 40 years, that's going to be 4 or 5% of the human race that is in migration. If we don't understand and learn how to deal with this at this stage, we don't have a prayer in another generation.
Any rebuttal?
No.
Great. Thank you. For the last question of our foreign policy section, Mr. Norris. How should the U.S. and our NATO allies respond to Russia's growing influence in the Middle East and the world? Is Russia's growing influence a concern?
It is absolutely a concern. It is a concern not only in the Middle East, it is a concern in the Arctic. The Soviet Union has set upon a military presence and aggression across the Arctic as the northern polar ice cap has melted. That is going to continue. We have yet to mount even a cautious response to their level of militarization of the Arctic Ocean. Russia right now is being run by a group of oligarchs who have a leader that quite honestly scares me to death. We gave him an opening in Syria when we did not handle the Syrian civil war properly. We have backed off in Crimea and in Ukraine, and he is the sort of person that is going to take that as weakness. So we and NATO have to push back. We have to be extremely firm. We have to use every financial vehicle we have to interfere with their economy that supplies their power structure. And basically, we don't want to get to the point where Putin so thinks we are ineffectual that he will try military against us.
Ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union some years ago, Russia has been struggling to find its place in the world. And Putin, as their leader, he's really a dangerous actor. And we can't underestimate the unpredictable nature of Vladimir Putin. The reason is because from my view and the view of a lot of Russia experts, is that his primary goal is to sort of, to borrow a phrase from another person, from Trump, is his main goal is to make Russia great again. And that's Putin's goal. And so the problem is that, and by the way, Putin is someone you might recall that Donald actually said he thought he could work with, which also should give you some indication of Putin's psyche. And so what we have to think about, not just the United States, but our allies around the world, in particular our allies in Europe and Eastern Europe, we need to try to predict what a large superpower like Russia, who has nuclear capabilities, is going to do. And this is a very difficult challenge for all of us. Of course, we were all worried when Russia set upon this course of aggression in the Crimea and in Ukraine. This is why I think that we can do two things. Number one, we can continue to reiterate our commitment to strong human rights and to the independence of those countries through NATO and our other international organizations. And number two, where appropriate, like in Syria, we can bring Russia back into the negotiations so that Russia can help actually find a place where they could make some good in the world and not just be these unpredictable aggressors.
Thank you both. That completes our foreign policy section. We will take about 5-minute break and then move on to the politics of the Democratic Party, the lightning round, and much more.
Thank you.
Thank you.